evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome to the lecture theatre in Trinity Hall, in person or indeed online. You're all very welcome for what I hope will be a really enjoyable and interesting session on how to make politics better. There's a question. And here we are on, I think it's a leap day, actually, we all just realised. So sort of, a magical day to be thinking magical thoughts. Also, it's a by-election. So politics, the beating heart, beats on. A fairly unusual by-election. It'll be interesting to see the results of that one tomorrow. And of course, we all know in Britain that we are a matter of months away from a general election. Probably we all, I think in the autumn, just possibly earlier, but most likely in the autumn after 14 years of a Conservative government. And of course, many of us also watching the United States with an election there later in the year too. Politics, I think we'd all say, feels pretty intense and is probably only going to get more so. And I think that many of us have for a while now had a sense that politics in this country, in the States and perhaps globally too, is pretty fractious, fairly divisive, very noisy. And we find ourselves asking whether our political systems and perhaps we ourselves as citizens and as voters perhaps don't always help. So this evening we're going to ask how to make politics better. And I have three fabulous panellists drawn from two worlds that I'm familiar with, Trinity Hall, but also my previous role at the BBC. So we have Dr. James Wood, who is a Senior Teaching Associate in Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Studies in Cambridge, and is a Staff Fellow at Trinity Hall. And James, your research examining the legitimation of economic policy making from a comparative political economy perspective, looking at the States, Britain and the European Union. And more specifically, I think your work explores how political and economic crises can be affected by the politics of home ownership and even household debt to build certain expectations and support for particular forms of politics. Before Trinity Hall, I think you studied and worked at the University of Sussex, King's College London, Copenhagen Business School. But before that, it's worth saying that James actually has real-world experience working for one of the largest mortgage joint ventures in the United States, so really knows whereof he speaks when it comes to political economy. In the middle here, we have Jo Coburn, a former colleague of mine from the BBC and one of the BBC's most experienced political presenters, regularly presenting politics since 2007, and you may watch her these days anchoring Politics Live on BBC Two. And therefore, Jo's had a real ringside seat at the events of recent years, the high-octane political drama of Brexit, the pandemic, the rise and fall of Boris Johnson, and the various prime ministers that we've had since. And Jo also often presents some of the big key political moments, autumn statements, budgets, election results programmes, and so on. And you can also hear her on a podcast, newscast, frequently too. And then we have Dr. de-Wit, an assistant professor and deputy head of the Department of Psychology here in Cambridge and a fellow at Trinity Hall. Lee first actually trained as a cognitive neuroscientist, but has made her way across to computational social science and experimental approaches to the study of political psychology. You've worked at Bristol, Durham, the University of Leuven, if I pronounce that right, and UCL before arriving in Cambridge in 2019. And your particular interest in the psychology of politics, issues of polarisation, persuasion, and we talk about how to have healthier political practice. So three really different but valuable perspectives on the subject. And I'm going to open it up, if I may, by asking each of you to just say a little about why politics interests you, what drew you towards it professionally or the study of politics, and what, really your engagement with the world of politics is. Perhaps, James, could start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary. I mean, my engagement with politics really stems from my time in the US. I mean, I originally, before I started working in the mortgage industry, I actually had a pretty cool job. I was working in the music industry as a recording engineer, but I ended up moving to the US and I got into a really boring job working in the mortgage industry. And I was just fascinated by this because I was actually really interested as to, well, why do people want to keep getting into so much debt? Why is the home so important? And why do politicians keep liberalizing credit and promoting home ownership? You know, it just sort of, I don't know, it made me think. And so I just started thinking, well, what is the role of this in our broader politics? And then starting to think, well, actually, it solves a lot of distributional questions. You know, we don't necessarily need to worry about income inequalities when we can deal with kind of, you know, having a nice big housing asset on the side. And things like that. So, I mean, that's what really inspired me to start studying politics. And from there, I started looking at how politicians discursively construct crises as a way of enacting change, which was a lot more interesting than looking at housing. So, yeah, that was how I got into it.
Your journey.
Yeah.
Jo.
I suppose mine was a little bit more obvious, predictable. It was my upbringing, and we talked about the two things they say you should avoid at the supper table, politics and religion. And mine was a pretty traditional Jewish immigrant family, and politics was discussed all the time. And we fell out all the time over it. And in the end, it instilled in me this interest in people, why they think in certain ways and what drove them to a certain set of values, as well as politics. And I got involved in campaigns at school. I then did the same at university. I went on to study history. Everybody in my family has studied history. And actually, when I say everybody, my father was the first person, I was the second, my brother was the third. So we're only talking about 3 people so far. And my boys. So history was very much what was on offer, and we followed in that path. I did politics, European politics and German, and I spent a year in Germany where, a little bit like you, although I was working as a marketing assistant, as it so happened, I didn't actually know what a marketing assistant did at the time, but I found out after a year. I wrote my thesis there on German politics, the Weimar Republic, and I decided then that I wanted to do something broadly connected to politics, and I flirted with the idea of academia in my postgraduate year where I did Hebrew studies. But by the end of it, although I enjoyed it very much, I decided academia was not for me. And so I then went out into sort of the world of commerce for a little bit of time. And it wasn't until I answered an ad in it was a student newspaper. Someone was looking for a German speaker. He was an ex-Reuters correspondent. He'd worked out in Delhi and in Brussels. And I went with him to a WHO conference in Brussels, a lot of it on the health issues of TB and AIDS. And we had to write the stories up at the end of the day. And after a week there, I realised I wanted to be a journalist, and I still wanted to broadly get into politics. Anyway, to cut a long story short, otherwise I'll do the whole evening on my backstory. I got into local radio eventually in, funnily enough, Oxford. And I had been there at university, then ended up working there at the local commercial radio station, and eventually the BBC advertised for a London political correspondent. I got that job. I covered one of the most bizarre contests, which was the Ken Livingstone versus Geoffrey Archer to be the first mayor of London. The latter ended up in jail, having perjured himself at an earlier trial. And I thought, this is great. And I've never left politics.
Thank you, Jo. What about you, Lee?
Well, as a psychologist, I should obviously thank my mum for getting me interested in politics. She got arrested protesting against the Iraq War when I was at university, and so very politically minded. I started out studying psychology, though, and I did that at a fundamental level, looking at the cognitive science and neuroscience of how the brain worked. But I've always been very concerned about climate change. From a young age, I decided to be vegetarian and not drive a car and not fly because I was so concerned about these things. And I got into the sort of postdoc stage of being an academic, and I felt maybe I should do something more useful towards this climate crisis thing. So I actually quit academia for a little while, went to go help the Green Party, actually helped prep our candidate at the time for a debate, a chat with Jo. And
Did it go well, that?
it went okay, yeah. We certainly wrote it up as if it went well. That made me realize that my experience working with the Green Party is that, I passionately agreed with the things that people there had to say, but I was astonished how unable we were to persuade people. I was also astonished how unable people are to organize. You get a group of, like-minded people in a room, and we're passionate about climate change, and suddenly we're arguing about who gets the leaflet strategy. And our humanity and our psychology gets in the way of the things we want to achieve politically. And that's what really got me excited and interested in the psychology of politics. But I didn't know it was a thing when I was an undergrad, and I was also kind of annoyed that I was never taught about the psychology of politics. So it was one of my other objectives is to start, teaching people about this intersection between, the psychology of our values, how we process information, and how that shapes political systems.
Good, and we'll come to all these themes. Just before we do, though, I guess we should just pause for a moment on the title of this session, How to Make Politics Better. And it is based on an assumption that we do all think it's somehow got worse. And I think we should just pause and say, is that what we think? Maybe people have always complained about the state of politics and so on and so forth. But equally, I think, the level of critique and anxiety about politics is very high. So I'm curious whether you do all think politics is in a bad way. James?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by politics, right? I mean, there are two different ways of conceptualizing that. You can think of it either as politics as an arena, which is what we often think about, Westminster, Parliament, and so on. But then there's a kind of social politics, right? And that gets reflected in the broader social base. And I mean, these two things, they're interlinked, but they are different. And society is pretty fractious at the minute. There are lots of different groups who are struggling and lots of different groups who are competing with one another, and it's not harmonious by any stretch. And you see that getting reflected quite clearly in broader politics of this arena of politics. And so on the one hand, you can say, it is getting worse, and it's gotten much more intense, especially since the global financial crisis. People have been really struggling in this country with austerity, and the fallout from that and how that contributed to Brexit. I mean, you can kind of start building this story, right? The pandemic, inflation crisis. I mean, things are pretty rough. But there's this sort of broader social issues that are at play. And I think that, on the one hand, yes, it is getting more intense. But then if you think about it, if you extend out the time horizon, I mean, would we all like to go back to the politics of the 1950s? I mean, I would much rather live now than I would do in the 1950s. If you think about things like racial oppression, if you think about the marginalization of the LGBTQ plus community, you start to think about gender oppression. Actually, we've made huge strides in a lot of different ways. So, okay, things are pretty rough at the moment, but there are, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Things could be worse.
But it's the comments about the sort of social aspect of politics. For me, politics has definitely got worse. I take your point completely about progression in certain areas. But for me, the reason it's got worse is because people's faith in politicians being able to improve their lives is disappearing. Now, whether that faith was misguided to begin with is a different question. And I think there are a couple of broad trends that have fed into that idea. One is that the post-war settlement in the UK, particularly, is that we would be looked after from cradle to grave, that the welfare state would look after us. And the problem with the last 20 years particularly is that politicians of all stripes have failed to have an honest conversation about the fact that it's no longer sustainable. And it's no longer sustainable because of demographics, because we are an ageing, you guys aside, you're all very youthful, but we are an ageing population. That is getting bigger. We have a falling birth rate. We just are not going to have enough people of working age to pay the taxes to support the welfare system as it is currently constituted. And people don't want to talk about it. Politicians don't want to have an honest conversation. Now, there are lots of different ways of addressing it and solving it. But unless there is an honest conversation, and that for me is one of the sort of fundamentals that politicians have shied away from, people are frustrated about. They don't know about issues on social care, how they're going to be paid for. Young people are being asked to pay a very high proportion of their tax out of their income to support this ageing population, and everybody wants the standards of the welfare state to still be extremely high, and nobody wants to talk about it honestly. And if they don't talk about it honestly, then people lose faith in politicians to enact change. And it feeds into what you were saying, that there have then been global shocks, because globalization, which of course, as we know, greater connectivity, greater access to goods, to services, trade barriers disappearing, all of that has been, to a large extent, progress. The problem is global shocks have affected us far more than they would have done, again, 20, 30 years ago or back into the 1950s. There are some notable exceptions, of course. But if you look at the global financial crash, if you look at the pandemic, if you look at the war of Russia in Ukraine, it's affected us all directly. And again, our politicians here have not had the tools or the power or the narrative to say, I'm afraid we can't solve everything. The promise is always, we can and we will, and we'll do it better than the other lot. And the problem is they can't. The sort of flip side of that is people don't want them to say they can't fix it. And that is your I don't want to say what you think about it, but the psychology is so many voters say, I want you to fix it, and I don't want to hear you can't fix it. And that has led, I think, over the last decade or so, to simplistic but effective, take back control. I mean, it worked. I mean, what a great campaign slogan. It persuaded a lot of people who just wanted change. They didn't really care what it was. They just wanted to change the system, rightly or wrongly. But again, they don't want to hear that politicians can't fix it. And that then becomes a sort of circular argument with politicians. They're not wanting to have that honest debate. Or look at the sort of fundamentals. I mean, I don't know if any of you know Rory Stewart, the former Conservative cabinet minister. He's written this great book. I mean, it shouldn't be funny, but it is actually very funny. And he writes, so it's one little anecdote, because it literally lifts the lid on why government and politicians don't tackle long-term big problems. And Liz Truss was his Secretary of State for the Environment, and he was one of the more junior ministers. And she says, Rory, I want you to go out and do a strategy for rivers in England. Yes, he said, fantastic. I'll come back in a few months' time. Give me all the... No, I need it for an op-ed in the Telegraph on Friday. And that leads me to my other and final point about why I think politics is worse, is in the media, of which I am a part, the 24-hour nature, the feeding of the beast, the need that politicians feel and we demand to answer every little twist and turn, have a little clip, do a little clip with the BBC, ITV, Sky, Paul, everywhere. It's impossible to satisfy, and it distracts from the day-to-day grind of actually trying to construct policies. So that's why I think politics, in that broader sense, has got worse.
Lee?
Yeah, I think it's got worse in some ways for other reasons. I mean, I think, James, your point about, race relations, I think is a really interesting one. I mean, in the US, for example, people used to say, would you be happy with your son and daughter marrying someone of a different race? And people would would happily say no in a survey. At least nowadays, people will not say yes to a question like that. But if you ask them, would you be happy if your son or daughter were to marry a Republican or marry a Democrat, then often people will now say no. There is a sense of effective polarization where we don't just disagree with the other side, we actively, dislike the other side. We don't want to relate or engage with them. And why that effective polarization is increasing, I think, is unclear. It's clear that it's increasing more in the US than in other countries, although it did spike around Brexit in the UK, particularly with regard to Leavers or Remainers. I think one of the reasons for that is that I think the narrowing of the debate around economics and the sort of lack of ambition, everyone, we're sort of arguing over what tiny difference in GDP we're going to spend or what tiny difference in taxes we're going to spend has left sort of politics open to debates on more social and cultural axes. And I think immigration has been a huge shock to political systems around the world, and it's sort of brought to life this element of human psychology that relates this idea of cultural threat, that you feel your culture and society is under threat. And I think both sides of the political spectrum are not responding to that in constructive ways, but differently. I mean, I think that the right is to some extent flirting with this idea of cultural threat. You have senior conservative figures talk about, invasions of immigration or, swarms of people trying to get into this country, which I obviously don't think is responsible. But then I also think on the left, there's a response to those kinds of concerns which just says, well, if you are concerned about immigration, you're racist and we're not going to really engage with you. Whereas I think there are some, really earnest conversations to have about how do we construct a positive sense of cultural identity? How do we celebrate the things that we value as a country without necessarily, thinking that we're better than other people. Interestingly, one of the best predictors of whether you voted Brexit or not was your attitude towards the question, do you think that children should be taught to respect British values? And so there's a component of this value set that's really about, how you kind of create norms and enforce norms, which does correlate with attitudes like racism, but it isn't totally about racism. And I think the left also needs to engage more constructively with this value set.
I'm going to just stick with you a little bit more on this notion of the sort of psychology of why we vote the way we do or make the political choices we do. We think in theory that a democracy now, James, as you're saying, but everyone has the franchise. That's only been the case for, less than 100 years, actually. But, there we are. We do now. We will have the franchise. We have a media that is regulated and plural, and that will inform us, and we will be well-informed citizens, and we will therefore make rational choices between political parties who've laid out very clearly, their policies and their choices in the manifesto for us. And then I'm listening to you, Lee, and thinking, it's not really like that, is it? Because actually what drives us to vote maybe as much emotion or psychology or affinity or trend. Is there any space for rationality in politics?
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah. And I think often people would assume that, because I'm a psychologist, I'm going to focus on the ways in which we're irrational. And I do think we bring things to the political process that are not entirely rational. But I think, we also have to figure out who do we trust? Who do we look to as reliable sources? And actually, that is a fundamentally really difficult challenge. And I think sort of just dismissing people, say, when they believe in conspiracy theories or believe in misinformation, as if this is just an irrationality that is due to the behavior of an individual, rather than thinking about how systemically challenging it is to identify, reliable sources of information. So whilst I do think we do bring irrationalities to the political process, I think we also need to reflect on what the systems and structures are that would best help us navigate those. And thinking about, where do you turn to for reliable or trustworthy sources of information, I think is a really critical one. And I think the role of the BBC is really important in that. And I think it's really good the BBC is earnestly, grappling with impartiality. And I think an example I think about in this context is, say, climate change. Why aren't we taking action on climate change? And if you think about the psychology of that, psychologists might point to things like this idea of present bias, that we're more likely to respond to things that are in our immediate environment, that are happening soon. We're more likely to spend money today than save it for our pension. And I think you could argue there is some element of present bias in how we think about and engage with climate change. But we're also existing in an information environment where companies with huge revenues, billions of pounds, have been spending money on huge misinformation campaigns. It is no wonder that individuals have struggled how to think about or reason in this context or in this space. But I would also say that we can blame big companies. I also think within a democratic system we need to think more about where do we turn to for reliable sources of information. And I think actually universities have a greater role to play in actually really being trusted sources of reliable information. And I don't actually think that is such a core element of our mission statement at the moment. I think we were talking the other night that I think sometimes universities can be too keen to get something in the press cycle and get media attention, when really our modus operandi should be about being a trustworthy, reliable source. And I think for a democratic system, for a democratic ecosystem, you need sources of information that you can rely on and sort of trust to be impartial. One example of this, I think, was a really clear failing, in my opinion, is that there's a really prestigious journal called Nature. And a couple of years ago in the 2020 election, they came out and endorsed Biden over Trump. And I think this was really a mistake because, they're then signaling, we agree with a certain political allegiance. We have a certain political side. Well, for people who are trying to figure out, who do I trust, who do I not trust, you've now got a reason to think they're biased against me, they're for the other side. And an experiment was done on this subsequently, and they looked at Nature's endorsement for Trump and whether it persuaded anybody. Unsurprisingly, it didn't persuade anybody. But when then asked, would you then turn to Nature as a source of information if there were another pandemic or you needed information about a scientific topic, they'd be less likely to return to Nature. And I think we really need to think seriously about institutions in a civic ecosystem that people can turn to trust.
I think you're almost oversubscribing just how much people think about politics. I think a lot of the time people are just running off of instinct. To me, it's quite. I don't actually know that much about QAnon, but I'm pretty sure that Hillary Clinton isn't a lizard. But the fact, some people will believe this, right? And sometimes you just can't engage with that level of debate. But then what do you do when you're faced with those things, right? A lot of people are. They encounter information and they have their own confirmation bias. They believe it because they want to believe it, regardless of whether it's true or not. And that's one of the big issues, right?
I absolutely agree with you. But at the same time, what do we do about that? And I think
logical debate is necessary.
Not necessarily for everybody, but I think that's one of the interesting things about social influence is that it diffuses through networks. And it's not necessarily that you're going to impact everybody in a population, but there are some people who are very engaged in politics. And if you can influence those, that influence will filter through to people who are less engaged in the political system.
But I think it's that how do you engage people with politics? And I think the political system, for various different reasons, including what you were talking about with this kind of narrowing of, economic views, right? Ultimately, people don't engage with it, partly because they don't think that there's any point in engaging with it. And I think partly people just have lost complete faith that it's able to enact any meaningful change.
Well, I think that's what drives people towards populism. Yeah. If people think mainstream politics has failed or is failing them, then you might look for answers elsewhere. And one of the problems we have is how many voices across how broad a spectrum do you allow on mainstream programmes? I personally am of the view that you should have the broadest possible. When you talk about climate change, there is a general consensus because of the science that we don't allow climate deniers on programmes like ours at the BBC because the science has pretty well agreed that it is man-made and it is an existential crisis. But within that, you can have voices that say, I don't think the cost of that should fall on low-income families in the UK or the global south who've only just started to reap some of the rewards of industrialisation and so on and so forth. But you find in the social media sphere that politics is so polarised that we are called all sorts of things I couldn't possibly say in polite company for even allowing or giving oxygen to that sort of argument on one side, or if we're talking about immigration, views on the left that might say we would like free movement again, or we would like to take unlimited numbers of people, or others who would say we don't want to have anybody at all because it's seen as beyond the pale. But if you don't have those voices aired and those opinions aired, then you can allow for more extreme news broadcasters, maybe like a Fox News, to come in because they say, well, no one's expressing that view on the BBC. Well, we are actually trying to do that because there are people who think these things. And I have never, ever subscribed to the idea of things like the view that I've never kissed a Tory and couldn't ever do so. Or I wouldn't dare speak to that socialist who's sitting on the other side next to Jeremy Corbyn. This assumption that I know what you think about every single subject because you support that particular part. Yes, and Michael Heseltine, who probably most of you won't know, I mean, he's ancient. And he did say to me once, he was a leading Conservative politician, many people thought he should have been leader of the Conservative Party, he said to me, there is always an assumption that you must believe a certain set of principles on all sorts of issues because you're a Conservative or because you are a Labour Party supporter or even a member of the Green Party. And it's wrong to assume that. It's also wrong, I think, to subscribe to a certain set of geopolitical beliefs because you belong to a political particular tribe. If you don't, you should be allowed to say so without being cast out. And I think our politics has become polarised in that way, and identity politics has lent into it. The only thing I would say about identity politics is it does engage people. People get excited about identity politics. I mean, one of the nicest but most boring, probably, politicians who died recently, sadly, Alistair Darling, former Chancellor under Gordon Brown, was there for the financial crash. He said to me he never lost a night's sleep during the financial crash, the global financial crash, and the whole. He just did his job every day. But when the Scottish nationalists said to him he wasn't a true Scot in the Scottish independence campaign, his head exploded pretty well across TV studios. He was much more incensed about people sort of doubting who he was and what made him Scottish than dealing with the biggest financial crash that we'd had in recent time. And identity politics does that.
I agree with that. And I think this is one of the problems that we have in Britain and America when we look at some of these politics, is that ultimately I think a lot of people's national identity is probably the only successful identity that they have left.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who have been left behind from progress. And I think this is, there is a rationality and a logic that comes through a lot of this political instability, and there are various different reasons as to why people have been left behind. Globalization has winners, it has losers. I mean, I hate to use the term losers. There are people who are more negatively affected of globalization. Yeah. The same thing with our current economic policies. And what Jo was talking about earlier, there really isn't any room for the state to come in and deal with those problems effectively. And, where does that dissatisfaction go? What do you do if you're in Blackpool and you don't have a good job? You don't have any great welfare benefits. You can't get a good education to retrain. Even if you do retrain, you can't move. How can you move to London if you're stuck in Blackpool and you've got no savings?
So, James, when you're looking at these, big economic trends, often global, not even just, nationally based, and then people trying to look at different political parties or think who they might vote for, and you have politicians who make out that they're offering something really different from each other. Look at Trump and Biden, or Sunak and Starmer. They're trying to paint a very different sense of themselves and the terrain. But are you saying that in the end they're not necessarily offering anything massively different or huge choice, which again perhaps leads people to feel rather disempowered about who they might vote for?
I mean, the great political philosopher David Hume would write that, ultimately political parties focus on constructing differences between the two of them. And so even if they're very narrow, what they do is they make an absolute mountain out of a tiny molehill just to say, no, look how diametrically opposed we are. Don't vote for those other guys. They're so far over there. You need to vote for us. And that's something that has held true over the centuries, I think. And ultimately, if there isn't that much room for maneuver, you can't be a successful politician and say, there are all these problems and I can't solve them. You're never going to get in. You've always got to be solutions focused. You've got to sell that to the electorate. And I think that's what they're trying to do, basically. Yeah.
I mean, do you think in terms of what persuades people to vote a certain way has changed inexorably from the sort of ideological differences that were so clear in the past? Conservative supporters, broadly, landowners, wealthy, Labour, the party of workers. I mean, this is obviously a long time ago. And the parties have not adapted, even now, effectively to the sort of shifting sands of left-wing economically, but socially very conservative, to left-wing economically, but actually very liberal-minded socially, and then the reverse, right-wing, and so on and so forth. Boris Johnson, ironically, pulled off that great electoral trick, and I suppose it was a trick to some extent, by managing to combine those two very, very different electorates, what we like to call the Red Wall, the former Labour voters in former industrial cities and towns, many of them in the Midlands and the North, and still holding the sort of shires and Tory voters there. It was almost impossible, but he did it, and he did it with a pretty impressive victory. But I'm not sure it'll ever happen again because you cannot construct a political narrative to please both sides. Brexit was the thing that joined those together at the time. Even if a lot of people in the Conservative shires were Remainers, they weren't going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. So there was a sort of perfect storm. But do you think those allegiances have been broken completely, those political allegiances that people might have had from family, from the towns they grew up in, post-Brexit?
I think we've seen a shift in the axes along which people vote, and exactly that realignment towards that, social axis. And I agree with you that Boris Johnson sort of magically managed to combine the sort of levelling up slight left with the socially conservative get Brexit done, which, has unravelled as a sort of illusory position that he could never really maintain. And I do think that is a challenge that our political systems are going to have to grapple with, how you deal with these two axes and how you relate to people on both sides of it. One of my concerns at the moment is that I think the Labour Party understand much better that that's part of why they lost the 2019 election. They know that they lost that socially conservative voter. And so Keir Starmer is doing things like saying, he's going to prosecute the smugglers who are helping with illegal migration, which really taps into that socially conservative mindset. I mean, that there's a wanting to punish people who deviate from social norms that is part of that socially conservative way of thinking. So there is a clear link to that sort of way of thinking there. But I think often the strategy, and there was a Guardian article leaked, this sort of briefing to the Labour Party that, they need to have Union Jacks in the background all the time. And I do think there's a slightly superficial appeal to that sense of patriotism and national identity that I worry if all the left does is think, we need to have a flag in the background. We're not going to fundamentally grapple with what this dimension of social identity is and think about how we construct more positive notions of group identity and social identity.
So it's much easier, it seems, to focus and talk about the ways in which politics is challenged and difficult and divisive. But let's have a go at, therefore, what could make things better. And perhaps, there are three dimensions and you may have thoughts about any or all of them. We perhaps go through them because there would be sort of structural things. There'd be big reforms about, political funding in the United States or House of Reform Lords here, or, these sort of structural changes one could bring into the system. There's something, Jo, I was, about politicians themselves and how they might conduct themselves with the media alongside. And then there's something about, us the voters, really. But when you think about the structures of our systems, do any of you see anything that you think, gosh, if we made that change, that could make a difference?
I'm not convinced that one or even a combination of structural changes would radically make politics or make people's lives better. And actually, the fact that there's very little to choose between the Conservatives and Labour Party at the moment, particularly on economics, because there's no money, on economics is partly having a sort of chilling effect, if you like. But individually, if you looked at some of the structural changes, and we've thought about it, we've discussed it on the programme, proportional representation. It would allow parties like the Green Party to get more and better representation. The problem is that some of the examples of countries with coalitions, they're not great standard bearers for that kind of politics. I mean, if you look at Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland party is doing particularly well. And maybe, there's a significant number of people, probably from the former East, who would support it. But a lot of people think that wasn't a positive. I mean, you look at Israel and you look at Netanyahu's government. To some extent, he's got into bed with some very unsavoury characters out on the far right as a result of a coalition government where you have to build connections with parties that are perhaps less desirable to a lot of people out in the public. So I can't see that selling in a sort of UK political system here. Votes for 16, well, of course, we do have some elections where that happens. We also do have some proportional representation, sort of varieties of it in mayoral elections and so on and so forth. Would it get a better result? I mean, I suppose we don't know, apart from the few elections where it's been tried. I'm not sure, personally, I think it would be radically different. I would like to see better leadership. And for the reasons I sort of said at the beginning, I don't think there's been the sort of strong, effective, inspiring leadership since Thatcher and Blair, when you like them or loathe them. I think
How would you get it?
Well, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because Tony Blair, to some extent, with the Iraq War, there was a sort of devaluation in the currency of a strong conviction politician that to some extent took away some of the sting that Thatcher was criticised for being such a divisive politician who won her support from certain parts of the country and rejected others. But both of them enacted change. Thatcher probably more than Blair with her brand of economics. I mean, she drove through a very powerful economic programme, probably reflecting Reagan at the time. Blair's slightly different, but what Blair did was that he perfected the art of persuasion. He perfected the art of reaching out to the other side and saying, vote for me, I'm all right, don't be scared. It'll be okay. You don't have to vote Conservative. Whatever. You can vote for me. We haven't really seen that. The coalition years, well, we did have, of course, the coalition government. And actually, the one thing I would say about that was it was an era of calm, relatively speaking, of calm. A bit boring for us, actually, in the covering politics. But it was an era of calm. They did the job of politics. They went through their red boxes. They actually did kind of do stuff. But austerity, which the Liberal Democrats have never got away from, slightly poisoned it. So leadership is important, and I'm not sure how we get leadership. One of the things I would say is that perhaps, very unpopular, we do get the politicians we deserve. They're a reflection of society. It's a great book written by Isabel Hardman. If you ever want to sort of follow this idea of why we get the politicians we have, we could pay them more. We could, if that was the incentive, with, a lot of brilliant people who should go into politics don't, or they drop out. Perhaps we should have had you going into politics, maybe not on the money, but, maybe that would be an idea. Michelle Obama, in her book, Becoming, was not really into the idea of getting into politics because it didn't pay enough. It just, public sector wasn't attractive enough. I think we need to look at these sorts of things to get better people in. I think, for me, I think so.
What about you? Do you see anything you think that could really help?
I mean, I agree with Jo. I mean, in many regards, I mean, I think, there is a leadership vacuum, which is a massive problem. The purpose of electoral systems is just to elect leaders. So choosing between two is neither really here or there. And I completely agree with the points that Jo's making about proportional representation systems. If you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, Germany and so on, they're not free from all sorts of problems. And even they've got really low levels of inequality as well. And they've got rampant populism. I mean, all sorts of issues. So I don't think changing the political system really works. I think for me, a lot of it is really about getting people to realize what is important to them in terms of politics and stop listening to a lot of the noise. Don't listen to the politicians' narrative about what they're trying to get you to focus on, rather than the kind of those big wedges between them. What are the things that are really important to you? Make sure that you're actually engaging with those issues and engage with your local MPs on those issues rather than getting sucked into a discussion about wokeness or not. It was the same thing years ago, political correctness, that was a massive issue. It's just the kind of recycling of these arguments. We saw the same thing in the 1950s and 1960s when, the rise of the civil rights movement in the US, a lot of that was just decried as communism and Marxist intellectual thought. these things are, we can't stand in the way of social progress. And, we need to get people to focus on the things that are actually important. Why can't we just have good schools, good pensions, good healthcare, affordable housing? These are the things that people really care about, not these other issues.
I mean, on that, I'm sorry, if I was Prime Minister for a week, housing would be the one issue that I think would be transformative.
So, Jo, what is the media's responsibility here in terms of, helping holding the politicians to account to talk about the things that James is saying people actually care about? Or
the thing is, people are interested. What sells newspapers? I mean, I know that's terribly analogue and, last century, but what sells newspapers, gets people to tune into programmes and schedules and so on and so forth. The rise of podcasts has been interesting as a challenge to us in the media, is quite often the stuff that is not serious answers to serious questions.
Entertainment complex. Is it. Yeah,
it is.
That's it, exactly.
But that's because partly is your point that actually people think, I don't have any stake. Yeah. And so if you don't have a financial stake or capital, then what is it? What are politicians talking about that really affects you? Or do we go away from that? Do we move away from capital? Have a universal basic income? No one's offering that, but I think it's difficult for people who don't have a stake at the moment to buy into the political system, and then you go for your, what was it called? The
political entertainment complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's essentially like EastEnders for intellectuals. Right, that's what it is.
It is. Opera, the sort of opera, inside the Beltway, Westminster Bubble. No, I mean,
and that's why people don't take it seriously.
Yeah.
That is it.
So Lee, do you see any change that you would want to bring about that might actually help?
Yeah, I mean, getting human beings together and getting them to try and agree on something is really difficult. I mean, we know that from governing body a couple of times a term. But, I do think there are ways in which you structure discourse that can be more conducive to positive outcomes. I think some of the work looking at, whether social media platforms have algorithms that emphasize, hatred or division, or emphasize where there's consensus. I think things like that are important to look at. I think pay is a huge thing, and thinking about, how we pay our politicians and how we recruit our politicians. I was astonished when I was helping the Green Party. We're helping lots of councillors get elected as well. And I couldn't believe it. And the way that's constituted in Bristol is that the city councillors, it's a job for like 2 days a week. Back then you got like 11 grand to do it. There's no way you do this unless you were, young and really idealistic, or old and retired. And so there's no pathway to demonstrate that you're an effective politician through going through local government. And I think that point also about, having a stake, people do care about their local environment. People do care about things in the local environment, but local politicians don't tend to have any power to do anything about it. So people don't learn this relationship of how democratic systems can work. And I think really it's a principle of human psychology that, the more you can bring things into things that are concrete, that are within people's, circle of control, the more likely they will engage with them.
And all three of you, in a way, are actually saying it's kind of, in the end, it's on us, partly as citizens and voters and individuals. But sometimes it feels terribly hard to do the right thing and follow only the trustworthy information and not get distracted by the bubble and the Trump shenanigans. And
that's the famous great quote, you've got to be the change you want to see in the world. That's true. You can't wait for somebody else to make those changes.
I'm going to ask each of you about your social media use and whether you feel you have a healthy relationship with social media. James.
I mean, the only social media account that I have is a Twitter account. I did have an Instagram account, and the Reels was just, I just lost myself in what I thought I was spending 2 minutes on turned out to be about half an hour. And it just completely terrified me that what I started looking at and how it ended up into just cats playing with each other, and then me just looking at that over and over again. I just thought, that is terrifying. I cannot have this in my life, otherwise I will get no work done and I will get fired. But I did use Twitter up until Musk bought it, and I think just Twitter is a hell site, right? I mean, it is just being able to just talk to people anonymously, and just the trash that people talk at you, and some of the stuff that I've had lobbied at me being just a very low-level academic, it's really unpleasant. I can't imagine. I mean, what it must be for people in the media or politicians is ghastly.
Some of it is really ghastly. Some of it's quite funny. I don't do much social media, but that's because I am not very good at it. And so my sons always say, oh God, don't even try. Because I have learnt to be able to do Twitter and clever, snappy messages, but it's taken me quite a while. I don't do very much of it. So I've got a Twitter account and I've got Instagram. Facebook I use, but of course that's for old people, as I keep being reminded. And I try and do as much of it as possible through my work. The sort of work angle, the guests we're having on, the interesting things they say, and less about me. If I can possibly manage it. And, and also at the BBC, and I really have realised the benefit of not showing any bias, party political bias. You can still have opinions, but just not showing party political bias.
Yeah, I've got some great cycling photos on Instagram, if any of you want to have a look at those. I also stopped using Twitter, and actually I feel really uncomfortable about the way in which universities engage with social media. I mean, you look on lots of university websites and you'll see a sort of embedded Twitter feed, or X feed as it now is, as part of the website. And I sort of think, when did we as academic institutions decide that we were engaging in this platform and essentially endorsing the way in which it has algorithms that shape the way in which information is shared? I mean, colleagues of mine in the psychology department have done research showing that, if you use language that expresses hate, particularly where that hate is linked to an outgroup, that information is more likely to get spread on social media. I feel really uncomfortable about the way in which academic institutions have engaged with these systems. It's one of the things I mean about academia taking more seriously how it thinks about itself institutionally as a sort of, trustworthy source of information.
So you end up back with this business of trust, actually, and thinking of the months ahead, running up to an election and everything else that's going on. This is a last question before we open it up. If each of you were to give our audience a kind of tip for how to get through the next months or make the most of them, or be an engaged citizen rather than just a simply overwhelmed one, what would your advice for the next few months be, Jo?
Well, I've got...
I can watch your show, obviously.
Yeah, well, of course, that's an absolute must. It's on the iPlayer, BBC Two, 12:50. I do my little promotion. I think it's always good to have some binge watching of various series that are away from the sort of seriousness of day-to-day living, and have a holiday book. No, well, that's for me personally at the end of it all. I just wanted to come back briefly on the social media, because I suddenly thought the three of us are being slightly down on it, because if I'm honest, I couldn't live without Twitter or X at work. When I'm live on air on a Wednesday, particularly watching PMQs, and I miss something, and I'm flicking through my trusted sources. I mean, I know most of the journalists, the political journalists, and they're very, very good on all of the main papers and at Sky and so on and so forth. And if I read that, I can get an instant take of what's happened, their analysis and interpretation. I'd love to think that I have always got the perfect analysis of what's just been said at PMQs. I mean, the example this week, whether you watched it or not, with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer basically saying your predecessor, Liz Truss, was horrendous. She's dabbling in deep state conspiracy theories, and she's an extremist. And Rishi Sunak said, well, your predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, never got rid of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, was not patriotic, and didn't quite put it like this, but, and preferred Russia to the UK. Anyway, so you're watching it all, and then someone had neatly put, forget who it was, neatly put, so PMQs was basically your predecessor was worse than your predecessor, your racism is worse than my racism. And in a way, that sort of summed up, and I thought that's a very neat way of me giving my summary after PMQs. And Twitter and my colleagues had provided that. So I may not engage in it, but I do like it very much as a source of information.
You trust on it, though?
Completely, yeah.
Trust, yeah. James? Survival tips?
Survival tips. I mean, bearing in mind I'm also a tutor for the college, I probably have to say, focus on well-being, so exercise to deal with stress rather than turn to alcohol or anything like that. That might be a more natural reflex. But no, I think in general, I mean, look, it is going to get very intense. And I think the thing is, look, we're at a point where it might seem really overwhelming about how negative things are. You know, I mean, my wife is American. They've got a lot of family in America, and a looming Trump, victory is absolutely terrifying. She's got a lot of little sisters, and all the stuff, the attacks on women's rights there. I mean, it's really, really awful, and it's really easy to get really bogged down on the negativity and the harshness of what's going on. But I think, try and regain some optimism. If you don't like what's going on, try and figure out how to change it. Try to block out the noise and focus on something that you do really care about, and try and make that change and see what you can do. So try and be positive in the face of such hostility.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that point about having leaders who are really effective at persuasion and really think about how to persuade. And I do think there's something about that we've sort of lost in thinking about, someone disagrees with me, so I just think, they're wrong or they're bad, and I'm not going to engage with them. And I think ultimately that isn't how a democracy can function. And we do need to actually, listen to people we disagree with and understand their perspective and think about, why we have differences. I think
maybe be prepared to change our mind, actually, in the face of
change our mind ourselves. Yeah. So talk to someone you disagree with and really try and understand where they're coming from, rather than just, look at them through the lens of your stereotype of what someone on the other side thinks.
I totally agree with that. No, it's a much better way. I mean, one of the inspiring things that I have had the pleasure of enjoying in my years recently on this programme are the number of young people, sort of age you are, who come onto a live television programme that I would never have been able to do in my 20s and articulate a viewpoint, an opinion, and hold their own. And we do training, particularly for young women journalists. And I think that's great. And they get the chance, like today, with former Conservative Minister Ed Vaizey, who's a peer in the House of Lords, talking about housing, renters reform, with a young social housing campaigner called Kwejo Twenaboa. And there they were. He's only, I don't know what he is, very, very young, and Ed Vaizey is in his 50s, and he's able to do that, and I think that's marvellous.
Good. Right. Questions, thoughts, and we've got a microphone, so Becca, we'll start over at the top at the back here, and then if there are any questions online, we can take those as well, but no, not at the moment. Okay, good.
Thank you for speaking to us tonight. And I'm wondering, since we want an honest and transparent conversation with our policymakers, how should we ask them to engage with us? So clearly a 24-hour news cycle isn't conducive to an effective and efficient conversation. So how would you suggest that we ask our government to engage with us in a way that still leaves enough discussion through the government for policymaking, but gives us the transparency that we need to rebuild institutional trust?
What you want to be heard is what you're saying. How do you get them to hear you?
No, I'm wondering how the government can engage with us in a way that is effective, since the link between government and public is generally
this is perhaps the persuasion.
Also is one of the reasons why I think that we need to constitute councillors as a genuine career path. I'm quite engaged in politics, so I know my councillor for the local area in Cambridge, and I complain to him on a regular basis, and we chat about stuff. But I think you can most easily engage with people when they're in your local environment. And I think we have this real weakness in our democracy in that we don't have those local representatives who actually have some power and investment engagement in the system as a whole. So I think having more people at a local level, like we have in some areas of the country with mayors who can better engage with their local environment. I think that's what I'd like to see more of.
I don't know whether people ever listen to some of the phone-ins that have become a thing with politicians. And people quite like those because they can phone up. I think Nick Clegg was one of the first to do it, but, we have the leaders as well. But some of the politicians who do it sort of regularly, And I've sort of thought that is not a bad way to actually ask direct questions and quite often get some direct answers.
You meet, politicians kind of day in, day out, and it's easy for us all to sort of slag them all off. But what about the backbenchers and the constituency work?
Without them,
MPs engaged and
yes, they are.
dedicated?
And most of the politicians and the backbenchers, because they're the ones that come onto the programme regularly, are committed, hardworking and honest, and not just in it for themselves. Now, some are more effective than others. And seeing them up close and personal, I have a lot of admiration for these people doing a very, very difficult job. And I think for a lot of backbenchers, it's their constituency work that actually really excites them. Not everyone's going to be a cabinet minister or prime minister or even a junior minister. A lot of people want to represent their constituents, and they want to then represent them in Parliament, and they bring issues. I mean, there have been some incredible campaigns that have come from local people, brought to their MPs, and they have spoken about them in Parliament, and then there's been change. I mean, just to pick one, a recent one on the menopause, for example. I mean, Carolyn Harris is a quirky Labour MP, but she actually managed to effect change by reducing the amount that women pay for prescriptions. In fact, I think you pay a certain amount and then it's free for 2 years. These are small but important changes. They are lobbying on behalf of their constituents, and they don't get enough praise for those sorts of things. And I think having more women in Parliament has meant that some issues specific to women have had a lot more oxygen and airtime.
Thank you. Next door, I think, a question?
Thank you for the talk. I think throughout the whole talk, what seemed to be a big issue is the polarisation and the lack of dialogue between people, that seems that we're not actually having conversations. But then on the flip side, it seemed that you all seem to agree that structural institutional reform isn't the answer. And I was wondering why you don't think that actually creating those dialogues within our democracies and creating democratic institutional change might be the way forward. So, for example, thinking specifically of mini publics or citizens' assembly, specifically, for example, in Ireland, how abortion, a dialogue on abortion was created and abortion was legalised through these institutions. Why you don't necessarily think that dialogue should be happening within our democratic institutions by bringing people into them rather than just the traditional model of representation.
James?
I mean, I think that part of the problem is that you end up with sort of broader political inequalities, right? Just because you open things up to a citizens' assembly doesn't mean that everybody can engage with the citizens' assembly. There are, just bog standard elections. They're not perfect, but they do the job of kind of selecting leaders. At least you can talk, there's an element of equality there. And also, I mean, so people push their own agendas on certain things, and it's just the same thing where you basically goes down to sort of noisy politics and to things that we've dealt with in the past. I mean, I know that you've said that you're not a fan of citizens' assemblies.
No, I mean, I suppose consultations happen. So governments open consultations on all sorts of issues. And they are opening and closing all the time. And there's 6 weeks or so, usually. I think that's the average time. And anyone can contribute, and they do contribute. And policy is made or influenced on the back of those consultations. And they can be anything from transport to, in fact, one of the most recent one that's closed is about buffer zones around abortion clinics. And again, these are quite granular issues. They're not citizens' assemblies. And the reason I'm not a huge fan, and it's funny you mention Ireland, Switzerland is another country that has a lot of referenda, that's the plural of referendums. And the problem in the UK is it hasn't been a hugely successful mechanism, partly because I don't think a constitutional issue like leaving or remaining in the EU was a good one for a referendum. Scotland, I mean, it was divisive, but it was sort of easier, if you like. Almost in a way, social issues like same-sex marriage, which I think was also done a referendum in Ireland, worked very successfully. And so I'm not sure, I agree with James. I think the same people would dominate the citizens' assemblies, and you wouldn't necessarily get that broad spectrum of views. I don't know what people think about people going around the country, politicians getting on their soapbox and going around the countries and talking at town halls. Again, who goes to these things? I don't know.
You talked just a few moments ago about ways of bringing people together and listening to each other as much as sort of shouting at each other. So do you see ways of doing that, more systemic ways of creating those spaces?
Yeah, I think the Citizens' Assembly's model is something that should be explored more. I think it's a challenging one because you engage people in a discussion and then, the output of that discussion is not necessarily democratically representative. It doesn't have that mandate of an election. So I think there's a challenge there. But I do think there's ways in which citizens' assemblies can enable publics to come to a more informed, deliberative position on something. And my colleague Alan Renwick did some citizens' assemblies on Brexit that, led to a better compromise in those deliberations than I think our existing political system came to. So I think we should explore some of those more innovative democratic tools, particularly, for certain topics, and maybe particularly like articulating what the space of options might be that then might be put to a vote, for example, which is, what's happened when citizen assemblies have happened in relation to referendums. I actually do believe in structural reform. I mean, I just don't think it's sort of a magic, one that's going to fix everything, but I do think there are ways of structuring discourse that help mitigate the irrationalities that humans bring to democratic systems and processes. I do want to touch on, and there's something we haven't mentioned here, which is a sort of flip side, not a positive innovation we can add, but a problem that we need to fix, which is the influence of money in politics, which I think is a huge factor in the polarization of politics in the US. I mean, I think you could make an argument that, a lot of the more extreme Republican candidates were sort of funded and given a platform because of their position in relation to climate change. And I think that then platformed a lot of politicians who had a lot of views that, I think were pretty intolerable on other things. And by funding those people, you sort of stretched, as you say, the Overton window of things that would get discussed in US politics. And I really think we need to focus on and fix the influence of money in politics. I think it's much less of a problem in the UK than it is in the US, but I do think it's an element of democratic systems that I don't think we've actually optimized yet.
But I mean, in terms of structural reforms for the US, I mean, I think that is actually a really, really important one. But I think the bigger problem with the US is the Supreme Court, because actually the way that is structured is that deals with the biggest electoral issues, but by a non-elected body. I mean, there are questions ultimately that go through Congress that ultimately only get decided by the Supreme Court. And these kind of things don't, there's a tension there that I don't think is actually really very well explored, especially when there's the political stacking of the Supreme Court and also the role of money in the Supreme Court as well. I mean, that whole issue with Clarence Thomas and the lobbying that he's received directly. I mean, this is awful.
Different checks and balances system, isn't it, than we have? Yeah, Jane.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know what on that, the political stacking I think has been very problematic, is that here I'm a little sceptical also about governments outsourcing to quangos so that they're less accountable. And again, they stack them politically. I mean, I know from Conservatives who were very upset after the Blair and Brown years that every quango, funnily enough, was full of centre-left appointments. I wonder how that happened. And funnily enough, since that, the Tories took over in 2010, I know with the Liberal Democrats, that's happened in reverse. It can work, but again, I'm not sure about the effectiveness of outsourcing. Politicians should be accountable and elected in that sense as much as possible, directly.
Thank you. Any more questions? We'll take one here and then we'll go there and then we'll go this side and that'll probably do us. And we'll keep it moving now, please.
Thank you very much for your wonderful discussion. You talked a lot about effective polarization and also how many parties are kind of trying to force a sort of cleavage to mark their distinction. So what can we do to address this sort of false polarization so that politicians don't kind of fit in this vicious circle where they feel forced to represent perhaps the louder voices and forget a certain moderate segment of the population that doesn't get to scream as loudly or is perhaps less engaged?
I'm going to give you that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is directly engaging with your MPs where you can, is basically going to those constituency meetings, basically saying, look, I don't care about this issue. The issue that I do care about is X, making those voices heard. I mean, but also getting people to register to vote. I mean, this is one of the big problems, right, of actually going out and voting, and trying to push a political movement, try and organize. These kind of things do matter, but we're in a very fragmented society where there's a very big emphasis on individualism and individual actions. And I think the more that we can get people together to try and push to try and get the things that they believe in through, I think that that's the best way forward.
Thank you. I think the next question was a yes here. Pat, you're coming.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for your discussion as well. Touched upon briefly maybe a bit earlier on in the talk, were ideas of like demography, otherness, identity politics, and maybe even for you, Jo, your own story of why you got into politics. For me, the idea of this generational divide within social issues, economic issues, just sort of any sort of like political dialogue within my own family and my own experience, and I'm sure many of you in the room will feel the same, is something really definitive of like divisions within society. So I wondered, both as us as young people or younger people looking forwards to the future, like how should we act? And is there any reconciliation for some sort of generational divide which exists today?
I think there is. I don't like the generation sort of being played off, if you like, in policy terms against each other. But policies, as James said, you need to get involved because parties, both of them, have tilted towards older generations because they vote. I mean, it's no surprise that the triple lock, maybe it is the right thing, the triple lock, that pensions will go up by whatever is highest out of the three metrics that they use. I mean, if you were just looking at the ball figures, as you probably know better than I do, it seems unaffordable. But older voters vote and they want to keep the triple lock. So both Labour and the Conservatives, they just say, we're going to keep it. And I think there is a danger of that leading to a divide. The baby boomers, free university tuition, and then the promise of it being free under the Liberal Democrats and Jeremy Corbyn. And it's, of course, it's not going to happen unless they completely change the way universities are funded. There is a danger that generational divide becomes entrenched. And so I think we need to talk about the opportunities for young people in a different way. I think work should pay. It shouldn't be as much asset wealth, which probably needs to be taxed if they want to raise large amounts of money, rather than asking you guys to pay more out of your income for housing, whether it's rent or property, that is unaffordable, I think, for most people. Go abroad? Is that a terrible thing to say? I mean, there was an interesting article written in The Spectator. If you're under 30, you go, leave the UK. I mean, I'm not saying it as a sort of, it's a terrible place, but what I'm saying is the West is broadly in decline, isn't it? I mean, it's broadly economically in decline.
You're in the States, actually.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, no, but I'm talking about sort of Western Europe. I mean, I'm talking very broadly here, but I think there are really big challenges for young people, and they're not insurmountable, and you guys have got all the advantages. And I think one of the other, I'm afraid, big unfair parts of society is the bank of mum and dad. And that's becoming more entrenched now too, that without the bank of mum and dad, there are so many things that young people can't do. One of you mentioned even paying for your travel to go to see, I don't know, a play or whatever it is. If you don't have money being given to you, you can't do it. And that, immediately there's this big divide. So I'm just saying it in a slightly flippant way. But I mean, I'm thinking, what can people do? Don't be
What would you say to the next generation?
We had a Lib Dem on the panel.
Yeah.
Who said it was surprising that young people aren't more revolting than they are. And I do think that's incredible, actually, that young people aren't protesting more and opposing more the really unfair lot they have. And I totally agree that the focus on wealth rather than income is really unfair and creating a lot of disadvantages. I think though the other thing I want to say about that is that often we say, young people should go out and vote as if it's young people's problems. Well, we're the ones who've brought up a new generation who are not engaged in the political system. It is adults who need to take responsibility for ensuring that the next generation engages. And I think we've never really thought through what does an educational system looks like that actually equips people to function in a democracy. And I think we could do so much more in schools than we do.
Thank you very much. So vote, that's definitely a message. We've got a question at the very end and then just in this row here. If you could come.
Cheers, thanks very much. Really interesting talk. I thought just picking up, I was going to ask a different question, but picking up the last point, I thought it was really interesting because I was one of the many young people involved with the student protests to not increase the fees. I was involved with the Labour Party under Corbyn and Remain as well. I was one of many young people who got involved, and none of those, maybe it was me, but none of those issues went my way or other young people's way. That's a big lesson I'll take away. But I guess a lot of people say, oh, young people don't vote and stuff, but a lot of young people have participated in things. And can you see in, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, a lot of young people in this room might be foot soldiers for something a little bit more, I don't know, less democratic in its flavour, maybe, if things don't, I'm not threatening anything, but if things don't, if there isn't some sort of give to young people, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I think populism, people are driven to it because they keep trying and they keep thinking the system's not working for me, so I'm going to go out of the mainstream. Keep campaigning. It will happen, I promise. At some point, it's worth doing. But I think all of the political parties have got to have a better offer for people under the age of 30.
But I think one of the key things as well, though, is that, I mean, when you look at trying to create massive change, like those student protests around tuition fees, they went on for a couple of years and then they just stopped. Right? I mean, you want systemic change. You want to make these things happen. You don't get what you want. You have to keep going. You have to keep plowing through. I mean, I'm reading a biography of Martin Luther King at the minute. And actually, I mean, the horrors of what they had to go through in order to enact the change that seems so like, why would anybody not want to end segregation in the South, right? To me, it's just so obvious. But, you know, what they had to do to achieve the outcomes that they want was so hard. And I think it is just about, you know, digging your heels in. If you want something, if you want change, get out there, mobilize, dig in, and just keep at it. And that's something that I don't think we have seen.
No.
Too long here? Oh, Shelley, have you got a question? Okay, we'll just take two online quickly, and then we're going to finish with you in the room. Yeah. Can you ask them both, Shelley?
Yes, I'll ask them both. Online questions. So the first one is regarding structural reform. How about changing the way that party leaders are selected? And the second, can you separate the failure of politics from the failure of politicians?
Well, on the first, there is a lot of discussion because grassroots Tories have been blamed for selecting the last three, not Rishi Sunak, as it so happens, because you're talking about a selectorate, a very, very narrow selectorate of people, and it's the same in the Labour Party broadly. But MPs on the Conservative side offer two candidates, and that's, you know...
Jo, do you actually think these are going to change?
No.
Not at the moment.
I don't think they are going to change because, of course, again, if you want to get involved in the future leaders, join a political party and become a member and so on and so forth. You have to be quite dedicated. I've been to some choice local party political meetings, but that shouldn't put you off because they are changing. But that is the only mechanism. There is talk about it because of what's happened recently. Will it change? Oof. It'll be very slow. So I think there probably is whoever it was asking online, I think there is a real need to change or reform the way the leaders are actually elected. Differentiating between the politics and the politicians, yes, I mean, that's why I think for me, where it's politics that has gone wrong and politicians are being given an almost impossible job to deal with the big issues of the day.
And finally...
So, Jo, you mentioned right at the start of the talk how a lot of politicians don't want to say and voters don't want to hear people saying that a certain thing is impossible and certainly, at least in a short term, can't be fixed. Now, where I'm from, Middlesbrough, similar to Blackpool, as James mentioned, is a place that's been hit hardest by policies like deindustrialisation, austerity, and now by COVID as well. And a lot of people living there, quite simply, are on the verge of a point where it's a choice between steal and starve, and the state is failing to provide for them. I know you both mentioned housing as a long-term solution for that, but at least in the next 5-10 years, how do you remedy the fact that telling these people that you can't fix their problems is going to either drive them to that or drive them to subscribe to a populist sort of politics that will.
Yeah, I'm Lee on this one. In fact, you can all have a go at this because I think it's a really fundamental issue, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, it is a really fundamental issue. And like I said, I mean, I think we need to grapple with this orientation in politics towards this social axis and the way in which these cultural values are shaping the way in which we vote. As I said, I think part of the reason why that cultural axis is so salient is because there's so little on offer in terms of genuine economic solutions to the problems that we face, and that inequality has been increasing, and that wages for those at the bottom in society have been stagnating. I think these are really big problems. Unfortunately, I don't have a solution to those, so I'll hand over.
Thinking about Middlesbrough, areas like Middlesbrough need better champions. And they've got champions. Some of the MPs in that part of the world are very effective. I think one of the structural problems with the UK is London dominates everything in a way that even Paris doesn't in France. In Germany, it's very different. In the States, of course, it's completely, federal. And I think this idea that London can feed the whole of the UK, in fact, Boris Johnson was the person who did coin this phrase, levelling up, but he wasn't honest about the cost. And I think someone once said to me that in order to level up Middlesbrough, the northeast, the west coast of Scotland, the south of Wales, with the southeast of England, would take the sort of money that Germany needed to unify. We are talking about hundreds of billions of pounds. And unless you're honest about that, we couldn't even do HS2. And so I think more champions, I agree with you about more devolved. In that sense, it would be better if you had local politicians with some real power to help areas like Middlesbrough, transition from a deindustrialised sort of years of decades since they were proper industrial cities and regions.
I'm currently in the process of writing a book about innovation policy in the US, and they have very targeted policies that are driven by the US's Economic Development Administration that are basically about establishing innovation institutes all over the country as a way of kind of redeveloping regions that have been left behind from globalization. This is an absolutely brilliant idea. It will work, but the amount of money that the American government are chucking at this is just something that the British government can't do without raising taxes. And that is trying to sell tax raises to the electorate is rough. And I think that's something that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have been talking about, have been saying a lot over the last couple of years. Look, the British, and it's something that Jo mentioned, British politicians are not being honest with the public. You need to say, look, you want to have a good NHS? We can have a great NHS, but we have to pay for it. And I think a lot of other people want everybody else to pay, right? It's all, people say, oh, let's tax the rich. It's not just as simple as that. We all need to pay into our share, and I think these are the kind of things that we need to get done.
Although, of course, people will always quote to me that actually UK taxpayers, we spend, or rather we are taxed far less as a proportion of GDP than France or Germany. But if you do literally a Google search of comparisons of cost of living, France, the UK and Denmark, let's say, I think that was the last time I Googled it. The problem here is the cost of living is so much higher because of housing. It's because the amount of your average income, outside of the cities as well, but particularly in all our big cities, can be up to 80% of your monthly salary will go on rent or a mortgage. And that means that raising taxes higher, because they're at a record high in the UK, they're still not as high as a proportion of GDP than other comparable Western European countries, and they pay more into public services. But I suppose the argument is that we have to spend so much more on basics like housing.
And that's what's shifting people towards like this kind of middle ground around kind of a very specific set of economic policies, right? Because we want a low taxation environment, we want a low inflation environment so that the interest rate comes down. And so essentially this is pushing a lot of people towards a kind of this neoliberal set of economic policies that we're complaining that the Labour and the Tories are doing, but that's what we want.
So, I'm going to stop us now because we can hear all that. No, not at all, not at all. I think the message has been loud and clear that things are quite difficult and there are a lot of challenges. But on the other hand, pay attention, be engaged, inform yourselves. And you do actually have the chance to vote. There is the offer of change and choice, or sticking in, with the current government party. So you have an option later in the year. So vote. I think that would be the main message from all of us. I've got one little bit of good news that I'm just briefly going to share with you all, because I think we've been talking about actually information and trustworthy information, and as is important. And as you all know, I spent many years as a journalist at the BBC, and I'm really delighted to be able to say that Trinity Hall is going to launch a prize for student journalism in Cambridge. We have a very generous donor, Jim Passamano, and along with Beth Soufiane, they have donated the funds to enable us to run a Cambridge-based student journalism prize for the next 5 years, and the more details will be coming shortly. We'll get it going next year. But I'm really thrilled and sort of proud, because actually I meet some of you in this room I know are involved in student journalism, and again it really does matter, and it's a great training ground for beginning to engage and think about some of these issues and get to end up being Jo on BBC Two. So all marvellous. So on that note, what I'd really like to do now is to thank our 3 really brilliant, engaged and insightful panellists, and also to thank all of you for coming.